Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We're now going to be moving on to some NFL talk, and I wanted to talk about the NFC North and the NFL draft that they had, where we saw a really, busy offseason from the NFC this past year. Started with free agency. The Packers went out and were impactful, bringing in Josh Jacobs and Xavier McKinney were really the big names. But I feel like the drama here only got more intense with the way that the NFL draft played out. So I wanted to give some thoughts on it. The Bears were really the team that had the most spotlight surrounding them because of the fact that they had the number 1 overall pick, which they obviously used on Caleb Williams. That was a no-brainer. Number 9, they also had, that was their own actual pick. Number 1 was from Carolina, so they held number 9 as well. It was interesting what they were going to choose to do in terms of there was the possibility they could go with an offensive lineman to help out Caleb Williams in this situation. Specifically, there was the detail that Caleb was actually teammates with offensive tackle Olu Fashanu in high school. He sort of alluded to the fact that he would be interested in playing with Fashanu, but instead they decided to go with Rome Odunze, who I love as a prospect, and I do think that this makes a lot of sense. They did just add Keenan Allen in the offseason, but it's likely going to be a one-season rental for him. He is somebody who's also dealt with injuries in the past, even though I thought that he had his best NFL season of his career this past year. So definitely going to be an impactful player for them there. DJ Moore's under contract for the next 2 seasons. Then he's going to be a free agent. They're going to have a decision to make. So as long as Odunze pans out for them, this move ensures that Caleb is going to have a solidified receiver 1 for at least the first 5 years of his career with the Bears, probably longer. And it's just a great job of them building around a quarterback after, of course, there was so much sort of mismanagement with the Justin Fields situation when they took him in 2021. The Bears actually did add an offensive lineman in the 3rd round. They took Karan Amegaji, who is an offensive tackle out of Yale, who definitely has potential. One of the better round 3 picks in my eyes. He took over Yale's left tackle spot his junior season, and he probably won't be the week 1 starter for Chicago, but it is at least maybe an answer in the long term. Maybe they choose to address it in next year's draft, but general manager Ryan Poles said that he has belief in Braxton Jones, who was a 5th round pick, I believe, in 2022. Definitely correct me if I'm wrong on that, but Amegaji has a chance to earn his spot in training camp. He's going to be competing for it. We'll see if that necessarily works out. But they addressed the offense with the first 3 picks of the draft, which is exactly what they needed to do in my eyes. Definitely put Caleb in a better situation than they put Justin Fields in during his first few seasons. And I do think that they have some legitimate playoff potential for next season. They won 7 games last year. Caleb Williams is one of the highest graded prospects in recent history and has a ton of weapons around him. I've talked about this before. If Caleb Williams is the player that a lot of draft experts say that he is, I think there's a chance he can have a similar rookie season to what CJ Stroud did last year. Now, CJ Stroud, I know that bar is extremely high, of course, but Caleb has more weapons around him, I believe, and I like the Houston situation as well, but Caleb Williams has all the talent in the world around him. Already talked about the receivers, but they have a very deep running back room as well. They just signed DeAndre Swift. They also have a couple other guys in that room, like Roshan Johnson and Khalil Herbert, who can be effective players for them as well. But down the stretch of last season, the Bears were 5-3, in large part thanks to their defense really coming into their own, and part of that was due to the fact that they got a legitimate edge rusher when they traded for Montez Sweat at the trade deadline, gave up a valuable second-round pick, but ultimately showed that it is a potentially very, very good move for them. It seems to at least be good, and they ended up paying him a ton of money, but the production was absolutely there, and it seems like he could be a cornerstone for them moving forward. The defense allowed 20 points or less in 7 of their final 8 games. Matt Eberflus, their head coach, has a background in defense, and I sort of like the stories that have come out about him in terms of being inspiring and having his guys play for him. And now he's getting some real playmakers on that side, like I mentioned, Montez Sweat, but the development of some of their key young pieces in the secondary, Tyreek Stevenson, Kyler Gordon, Jaquan Brisker. They obviously just re-signed Jalen Johnson to a new long-term extension. So the Bears are going to be, in my eyes, a competitive team, and they were the worst team out of the NFC North last year. Now, the other team that is probably a little bit more questionable is the Minnesota Vikings. Specifically, it comes down to how NFL ready is J.J. McCarthy going to be, is what it sort of bakes down to. But he's also going to, have some weapons. I feel like that defense is also pretty talented. They went out and spent big in free agency. They brought in some edge rushers and Jonathan Grenard, Andrew Van Ginkel. They brought in Blake Cashman as well to help as a linebacker. They were able to sort of steal Dallas Turner later in the first round. Seemed like he could have been a top 10 pick. He ends up going 17 to them later on. And this was a defense last year that Brian Flores blitzed more than anybody else. And now, ideally, they have some personnel in that front seven that can sort of generate some pressure without having to send a full blitz. So that's at least on the defensive side of the ball, the questions there. On offense, we'll see if McCarthy is even the day one starter. He's going to be competing with Sam Darnold for that starting quarterback position, but around them, it's the top 2 receivers, of course, in Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison that are going to make life easy for any quarterback. TJ Hawkinson, also one of the top pass-catching tight ends in the league, and their run game has been very subpar for the past couple years, and now they went out and signed Aaron Jones, who I do think is one of the upper-tier running backs in the NFL, so definitely could be a friendly situation for whoever's there at quarterback. I would imagine that the Vikings are probably going to finish last in the NFC North, but I also love their head coach as well in terms of the offensive mind of Kevin O'Connell, and I think that he can do a lot of good stuff for J.J. McCarthy. I feel like this was a really good landing spot for him. Again, a little unknown as to when he will play, but Vikings can definitely be competitive. And then the top 2 teams in the NFC from last year both made it to the second round or beyond. In the playoffs is the Green Bay Packers and the Detroit Lions. I thought the Packers had an A offseason. I thought they did pretty much everything they needed to do. Started with addressing, not that there were that many holes on the roster necessarily, but they did get to address the secondary a little bit, bringing in Xavier McKinney, who's definitely an upgrade for them. Now, hopefully they can actually get a healthy season of Jair Alexander, who has been very on and off the field for them, but just continuing to sort of develop as a young team, I feel like is the number one thing for them. It's not that they aren't talented or anything, they just are very inexperienced, and that goes to, the conversation surrounding Jordan Love, but also the plethora of receivers that he was throwing to that are all on rookie contracts: Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, Jaden Reed, Dontavian Wicks, and his top 2 tight end targets as well, and Luke Musgrave and Tucker Kraft, I believe, were both draft picks in 2023. So, this is a team that I don't know if I'm ready to go, Super Bowl contender yet necessarily, but they are continuing to develop with one another. They spend their first round pick on Jordan Morgan, offensive tackle out of Arizona. To be honest, I don't know tons about him necessarily, but fully understand the idea of trying to go out and, give your franchise quarterback some extra help. And then I thought the fact that they were able to get the number one linebacker off of the board in the third round, I believe it was, when they got Edgerrin Cooper, linebacker out of Texas A&M, was definitely a positive for them as well. Now, hopefully they see some more production from Lucas Van Ness, who was their first round pick last year, and they could, really get cooking there again, where I just feel like the Packers have drafted very well, and obviously, Aaron Rodgers would tell you differently because it wasn't exactly addressing the needs that Rodgers preferred, but they have built up so much young talent on this Packers team that I'm not necessarily ready to say that, they're Super Bowl bound, but I definitely can't rule them out by any means. I mean, I thought that they outplayed the 49ers in that divisional round matchup until they sort of fell apart at the end there, and that definitely seemed like a learning moment for Jordan Love and the rest of that team, but they have just about all of the pieces that they could really use to get back to a similar position, if not better, and I am definitely very high on the Packers. And then finally, the Lions. I loved what they did in the secondary in the draft this year. The secondary was really the number one concern with them. They go out and they get a couple very promising cornerbacks in Terrion Arnold out of Alabama, and then it was in the third round, I believe, it might have been the second round, but they end up getting Ennis Rakestraw Jr., another very physical cornerback who maybe a little too physical, might take him a little bit to adjust to the NFL, but definitely a very promising cornerback. And, the Lions are a team that they also, as much as I said that, it's the Packers that should have came out of that NFC or that game against the 49ers, you can say the same thing about the Lions as well, who are a very promising team, should continue to be. I think coming into the season next year, they have to be, a top 2 team in the NFC. I kind of think it's them and the 49ers, really, and then you can have a conversation from there. But even still, it's a wide open conference, and the NFC North is going to be really interesting to me. I think they're going to have 3 playoff teams would be, my guess. Granted, we're at the beginning of May, so way too early to sort of fully dive into those things, but as long as Caleb Williams can be an NFL-ready player and produce for them, I have a little bit of a hard time to rule them out of making the playoffs next year. I think the Packers and the Lions should be shoo-ins as long as they're fully healthy as well, and I'm really excited to watch this division sort of take over the conference for years to come because of the young quarterback play. You look at the NFC and it doesn't seem like there's necessarily all too many young quarterbacks. It feels like the AFC has sort of been the quarterback renaissance. Obviously, Mahomes, Burrow, Allen, throw in Justin Herbert, Trevor Lawrence, all of those. But in the NFC now, you have Jordan Love and potentially Caleb Williams and potentially J.J. McCarthy. And this feels like the division that has, already competitive for this upcoming season potential, but potential for years to come as well. And I'm definitely looking forward to see how this all plays out. I think there's going to be a ton of storylines coming out of the NFC North. But let us know what you feel on the NFC North, what your predictions are, really in the conference as a whole. But we are going to be taking our final break of the show now, and when we come back on the other end, we're going to be continuing to dive into some NFL talks. I want to touch on the updates surrounding the T. Higgins and Brandon Ayuk situations, so stick with us, and we will be right back.